picked up some pointers that
Hey
he
guys,
used
I'm back.
to abduct, rape, and murder, 33?
August 8th, 1973, 8:24 a.m., Houston, Texas. An emergency telephone operator named Velma Lines picks up a call. She hears what sounds like a young man say, "Y'all better come here right now. I just killed a man." Not long after cops arrive at 2020 Lamar Drive, there they find the body of Dean Coral, a well-respected man known for once being the vice president of the much-loved Coral Candy Company. What police don't know is that this man lying dead on the floor will become known as one of the most depraved and prolific serial killers in history. He is the thing of nightmares, a real-life boogeyman whose crimes were so sick they were beyond sadistic. That young man who made... After he had his fun, which could take days, he would strangle or shoot them and then bury them on a boat storage that he was paying rent for, or in some remote area near the beach. Other times he tortures victims in the van itself. He'd fitted it out to be soundproof, so no one... Coral was still admired in the neighborhood. Who could say anything bad about the Candyman? Now we'll introduce Rhonda Williams to the story. She was an attractive...
Let's see what this is about.
It was truly bad judgment that Wayne Henley used when he decided to bring his good friend Rhonda to Dean Coral's house, considering that Wayne was genuinely concerned about the young woman's safety. He didn't understand the danger to which he'd exposed himself and his friends by taking them there. But bring her he did, without the approval of Dean Coral. Dean Coral was an electrician for Houston Power and Light, but most of Henley's friends knew him as the Candyman, so named because he'd labored for years in the candy manufacturing plant that he and his mother had once owned. Coral was famous for giving candy away to the kids. Elmer
Trying to get rid of the dinosaur.
had left the Corals' house in the Pasadena suburb of Houston in the hours of April 8th, 1973, to meet Rhonda. Earlier in the evening, Henley had been to Rhonda's house when he heard her father, who was drunk, yelling at her. Knowing that Rhonda was very afraid of her that night, Wayne promised to come back for her. With the face of a child and the body of a woman, tiny Rhonda Williams was suffering from some severe emotional and physical traumas. Her mother died when she was very young, and her father was an intimidating man. Then her first love, a boy named Frank Acquire, disappeared suddenly. Recently, she'd sprained her foot in an accident. While she painfully convalesced, her relationship with her father became increasingly strained, and he banned many of her friends from visiting the house. Wayne was the only one of her friends that her father liked. That night, frightened by her father's anger after he'd had too much to drink, she packed an overnight bag and decided to get away from the house until he sobered up. Wayne left Tim at a laundromat nearby and went to the house. She was too afraid to unlock her bedroom door to let Wayne in, so he came to the window to escort her from the house. The two of them then met Tim Curley at the laundromat. Wayne told Rhonda that they were going to Coral's house. She didn't want to go there, but finally agreed. Tim gave her a beer to drink. The three teenagers reached Coral's house around 3 a.m. Rhonda didn't realize that Coral was infuriated that the two boys had brought a female to the house, but she knew that something
Fucking
was wrong.
idiots keep doing that shit. I'm
Henley
gonna
was
kill
able
you.
to take the edge off Coral's anger, and the small party started back up again. While Coral smoked pot and drank beer, the boys drank some moonshine that Wayne's dad had given him. Rhonda joined them in smoking some pot and fell asleep while sitting against the wall. Hours later, Henley awakened to Coral handcuffing his wrists. His ankles had already been bound together. From much previous experience, Henley understood that torture and painful death were imminent. Looking around him, he saw that Tim had been stripped, and both of his friends had been bound with rope. Electrical tape sealed their lips. "I'm gonna kill you all," Coral shrieked, according to Henley. "But first, I'm gonna have my fun." Henry pleaded with Coral. He could help Coral torture Tim. Coral could assault Tim, and he would rape Rhonda. Then they'd kill Tim and Rhonda together. After threatening Henley with a .22 caliber pistol and a knife, Coral then took Rhonda and Tim into one of the bedrooms where he had a long torture board. Rhonda's and Tim's hands were handcuffed to the board, and their feet were tied with rope. Henley then convinced Coral to remove the tape from their mouths. "Cut off her clothes," Coral told him, and gave him a large knife. Henley whispered in Rhonda's ear his promise that he would not let anything happen to her. She asked him not to cut off the shirt she was wearing because it belonged to a friend, so he cut off her pants, whispering an apology as he did so. Coral tried to rape Tim, but the young man fought him as best he could. Henley got up to go to the bathroom, and when he returned, he picked up the gun that Coral had left on the nightstand. Coral's face was flushed with rage when he saw the gun pointed at him. "Kill me, Wayne," he challenged. "Kill me." Henley backed away as Coral charged at him. "You won't do it," Coral sneered at the terrified teenager. Around 8:30 a.m. that Wednesday morning, the Pasadena, Texas Police Department got a telephone call from an hysterical Wayne Henley. Patrolman A.B. Jameson raced over to the address, 2020 Lamar Drive, a green and white frame house. 3 teenagers, 2 boys and a girl, stood in front of the house. One of the boys, a timid, slender young man with light brown hair and a skimpy coat, came forward and identified himself as Wayne Henley. He motioned the cop inside, where Coral's body lay on the floor. Coral had been a sizable, muscular man, over 6 feet tall, and weighing approximately 200 pounds. His dark brown hair, graying at the temples, was styled in little waves. His identification showed his name as Dean Arnold Coral, a 33-year-old electrician from Houston Power and Light. Coral had been shot 6 times, with bullets lodging in his chest, shoulder, and head. His body was taken to the morgue, while the 3 teenagers were taken to the
You
police station
fucking
for questioning.
knickers.
At this point, detectives had arrived to examine the sparsely furnished crime scene, one of the more interesting ones they'd witnessed in some time. Of particular scrutiny
Get the
was
fuck
bedroom,
over there, you
which
dumb
appeared to have
knickers.
been rigged up for a special purpose.
Ugh.
Plastic sheeting covered the carpet to protect it from dripping blood. The bedding on the one single bed was all tangled and disarrayed. Most sinister was the large, thick plywood board with several sets of handcuffs, ropes, and cords attached to it. On the board was a bayonet-like knife, a huge dildo, 9 feet thick, glass tubes, and petroleum jelly. In a shed in the backyard was a plywood box with air holes cut into it, and some strands of human hair inside. Neighbors said that the house had belonged to Dean Coral's father, Arnold, also an electrician, who had let his son take over the place when he'd moved away. Son Dean had taken care of the house and had done nothing to arouse the suspicions of his neighbors in the quiet middle-class neighborhood. At police headquarters, detectives got quite an earful from the 2 teenage boys. Earlier, Tim Curley said that Henley told him, "If you weren't a friend of mine, I could have gotten $1,500 for you." Henry told police that Coral was a homosexual and pedophile that paid him to procure victims, which Coral later murdered and buried in a boat shed. Detectives took this revelation cautiously, as they would from any youth who claimed that the man he killed was really a criminal. When Dean Coral's father and stepmother talked to the police, a different story emerged. They said that the story the teenagers had told the police was a lie, and that Dean was a homosexual or a violent person. In fact, Dean loved kids and had always been generous to young people. These teenagers had taken advantage of their son's hospitality, and then, crazed by drugs, had murdered him in his own home. Had the police not found the implements of sexual torture in Coral's home, they would have been more likely to assume that the parents' version of events was the correct one. As it was, the police were more interested in hearing the confession of Elmer Wayne Henley and just who this Dean Coral really was. A sexual psychopath, or a victim of vicious, drugged-up youths? As police dug into Dean Coral's reputation and past, early returns suggested that the 33-year-old man was the victim, not the monster that Henley made him out to be. This sentiment was summed up in comments like this: "All my friends knew him, and my friends' folks knew him, and they never thought anything bad about him. They always thought Dean was a good dude. He'd help me, he'd help them, anything." Then an old girlfriend, Betty Hawkins, a divorcee with 2 small boys, came forward. She'd known and dated Dean for 5 years or so, and said only good things about him. Dean was one of the kindest men I ever knew. If he had something and someone needed it, he'd give it to them. So, as far as I know, he didn't have any special hobby, unless it was helping other people. The guy must have gone through 15 TVs in the last 5 years. Every time I turned around, his TV would be gone. Someone would come up and say they needed one, and he'd give it to them. He made me feel like I was somebody, and the biggest majority of men seemed to want to make me feel so much lower than them, and all they wanted was to take me to bed. In 5 years, Dean and I never really had sex. Sometimes we would hug and kiss. There were times when we came close, but we never did it. He believed that you should be married. There aren't very many like that. He'd say things like, "You know, I've been thinking lately, I ought to settle down and get married." But all of a sudden, he'd change his mind. And later, he'd say he couldn't afford to get married. And I'd say, "Well, I can work, you know." But he'd say, "No way. If we got married, you wouldn't work. Definitely not." Then some information started to leak out that suggested a different picture. A teenage homosexual.
Oh, this is no fun. Disturbed reality. Disturbed reality. Fucking niggers.
C.Drake. That's how I signed.
You fucking niggers.
Space-time. The sun and the moon, physical objects, everything that we see inside of space and time is just our visualization tool. The reality we're interacting with is nothing like the visualization tool.
Disturbed reality. Fucking idiots.
Space-time. Space-time.
Today's story inspired a popular horror movie, and when you get to the reveal in this story, you'll understand why. It is literal nightmare fuel. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious... In early 2014, a sheriff's department in a little town in Oregon conducted a search of a huge 20-acre farm tucked away inside of a forest. A local man had gone missing recently, and this farm was one of the few places they knew he had been. Very quickly into this search, a deputy was walking around the outside of the barn when he saw something strange on the ground. At first, he had no idea what it was, but as he got closer, it became very obvious. Not only would this discovery become front-page news all across the country, but it would also lead investigators to discover something much more sinister going on in that little town. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in the story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a cup of coffee, but be sure it's full of coffee grounds. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story.
That one?
By most people's standards, Susan Monica's life had been pretty good. She had a small but very close group of friends, she had a great job working as an engineer, and she lived in one of the most exciting cities in the world, San Francisco, California. But Susan was not happy. Moving to the big city was not so much a choice as it was a product of life and circumstance. Deep down, Susan had always been someone who preferred peace and quiet and being alone, things that were in rare supply in a big city like San Francisco. Many nights after work, Susan would come home to her apartment and she would sit there and dream about moving away from the city and living off the grid somewhere on a farm, raise her own food and be totally self-sufficient, away from everybody else in the world. And then one day in 1991, when Susan was 43 years old, she made that dream a reality. That year, she wound up purchasing a 20-acre farm located in a forest in a little town in Oregon called Weimar. However, this farm was really not a farm. There was nothing on it. There was no house for Susan to live in, there was no barn for her animals or tools, there was no running water, no electricity, no septic system. It was just pure Oregonian wilderness. But to Susan, it was perfect. The property kept her far away from other people, and she liked the idea of having to literally build her own farm. After all, she was an engineer by trade, so she actually knew how to build buildings efficiently and safely, and she was a big, strong, sturdy woman who was not afraid of manual labor. So, when Susan finally arrived in Weimar and made her way up the winding dirt road through the forest and arrived in front of her property and looked out at the vast, rugged landscape for the first time, she was filled with a rush of excitement. Even though there was nothing on her 20 acres, it already felt like home. Over the next several months, Susan would transform these 20 acres into a neat little farm, complete with a big barn and a shack for her to live in, and a few animal pens for livestock. However, after the farm was built, Susan realized that building the farm was actually not the hard part. The hard part was maintaining the farm, going out there every day and doing all of the chores, feeding all the animals and doing all the different projects she had in mind. It was exhausting. And so not long after the farm was complete, Susan realized that as much as she wanted to be totally alone out there, she had to set that aside and hire some help. And so Susan printed out all of these help wanted flyers and put them all over town in Weimar, and before long, people began making their way up to her property to inquire about the role. Most of these applicants were people who struggled to find work elsewhere, either because
It's a different
they lived
video of
sort
the same story.
lifestyle, bouncing around from place to place, so no one was ready to hire them long term, or because they had a criminal record, just straight up did not get a job. But Susan didn't care about either of those things. All she cared about was the people she hired would work hard and they would respect the peaceful, calm atmosphere she was fostering on her farm. Basically, do the work and leave me alone. And over the next 20 years, Susan would find dozens of people who were able to do just that. Most of them would work for Susan only for a short period of time. Others would stick around for a little bit longer, but eventually all of Susan's workers kind of rotated pretty quickly and moved on to other things. And when that happened, Susan would simply put up more help wanted flyers in town and hire more people. And in all the 20 years that Susan had been hiring these temporary workers at her farm, after they did move on and went somewhere else, Susan never heard about them again. However, that was about to change. On January 1st, 2014, Susan, who was 66 years old by this point, was outside of her shack out on her driveway when she happened to look up and see a car coming up her road. Now remember, she lives in the middle of nowhere. No one comes out to see her, so this is a very rare event. And so Susan is totally keyed in on this car. And this car, they pull into her driveway, and then out of the car pop 3 young people. It was 2 young men and 1 young woman. And before Susan could even ask them who they were or why they were here, they were telling her. They said they were looking for their father, Robert Haney, who at one point had told them he was working on Susan's farm in exchange for a little cash, and also Susan was letting him park his camper on her property, and he was living in that camper. The kids said their father always checked in with them at least once every couple of months, but they had just gone this really long stretch without hearing from him, and since he didn't have a cell phone and no permanent address, they had no real way of getting in touch with him, and so they were out there looking for him to make sure he was okay. And so they asked Susan, "Do you remember our dad, Robert? And if so, do you know where he is?" Even though this whole situation was totally
You
surprising
fucking
to
nigger.
Susan
I'm gonna
because
kill
she
you,
almost
fucking
never
nigger.
got visited, so that alone was kind of
God
but
damn
when she
you.
heard the kids say their
I'm gonna
dad's name,
slit your
Robert
fucking
Haney,
throat.
she immediately knew who that was. Susan told them that she had hired their father the previous spring to help build a structure on her farm. And initially, Robert was really nice to have around
She
the
shouldn't
farm.
have said
He worked
shit.
really hard, he kept to himself, he was quiet, and he had a dog that was really friendly and loving. But in August of the previous year, so 5 months into Robert's employment on Susan's farm, Susan would tell them that their dad totally changed. He started drinking really heavily and not really working very much and spending a lot of the day just kind of ranting and raving outside of his camper about how he wanted to exact his revenge on someone. Susan would eventually find out that what Robert was talking about is apparently one of his kids had been assaulted, and he felt very guilty that he had not been there to protect his child. And so the way Robert was handling this guilt was by drinking and thinking about getting his revenge on the attacker. Now, while Susan did understand why Robert felt the way he did and why he was kind of acting the way he was, it didn't change the fact that Robert's behavior had become very disruptive on her farm, and the one thing Susan really wanted was peace and quiet. And so she decided she would have to go confront Robert about his behavior and potentially fire him if he couldn't find a way to calm down. But before Susan ever had to do that, Robert one day just walked right up to her shack, he handed her an envelope filled with cash, and he asked Susan if she wouldn't mind looking after his dog for a while. And Susan was so taken aback by his complete change in behavior and this request that she just took the envelope and said, "Okay, I'll look after your dog." And then Robert nodded as thank you, he turned around, and he walked away from her. And then a few moments later, Susan's standing there with the envelope in hand, watching as Robert is climbing into some white car that had just pulled up in front of the property. She didn't know who was in the car with him, and then the car turned around and drove out of sight. Susan told the kids that that had happened back in September, so about 4 months ago, and since he left, she had not heard from him, despite the fact she still had his dog, and she told the kids that a lot of Robert's stuff was still in his camper. Susan brought the kids over to the side of her property where Robert's camper was, and when they went inside, sure enough, all their father's things were all over the place, but the one item that immediately stood out to them was their father's tool belt. They knew their father was a traveling handyman, that was how he made his living, and so it begged the question, why would he leave his tool belt here if he knew he was going to be gone for several months potentially? It didn't make any sense. After leaving Robert's camper, the kids thanked Susan and asked her to please be in touch if she learned anything else about their dad, and she said she would. And then the kids got back in their car, and they began driving south towards the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. When they got there, they asked to file a missing person report for their dad. However, they learned very quickly that it was going to be very challenging to locate their dad, because their dad lived this transient lifestyle with no cell phone, he had no permanent address, he had nothing that could really be traced. But the investigators agreed with Robert's children that their dad's absence was a big concern, given the fact that his last interactions with Susan had consisted of him drinking very heavily and talking about going and getting his revenge on his child's attacker. So the sheriff and the deputies were absolutely anything that could possibly allow investigators to track down Robert. And at some point, one of the kids said, "Oh, what about my dad's EBT card?" EBT cards, or electronic benefit transfer cards, are like debit cards for state welfare services. You can use the cards to buy things like groceries, and the cards are definitely traceable. A few days later, when Robert's EBT card trace came back, investigators saw the card had been used just 1 month earlier in a Walmart located about 30 minutes southwest of Susan's farm. Now, this trace obviously didn't tell investigators where Robert was right now, or what kind of condition Robert was in, but they had no other leads to operate on, so they decided they would go to the Walmart and see what they could find. When they got there, the investigators were led to the back room of the building, where they were able to review the security footage from the previous month when Robert was supposedly there with his EBT card. But after reviewing hours and hours and hours of footage, the investigators never saw Robert on camera. However, they did see Susan on camera, and unbelievably, she was the one using Robert's EBT card. And so obviously, this was very suspicious, and right away the investigators left Walmart, went back to their office, and began the process of getting a search warrant to search Susan's farm. To me as I was your pocket. Needless to .com. A few days later, on January 10th, the sheriff and his deputies arrived at Susan's property. When they pulled onto her driveway, Susan came outside to greet them. When she asked them, what's going on, they told her, "Hey, we're here to search your property in connection with Robert Haney's disappearance." And before Susan could ask any more questions, the sheriff said to her, "Hold on, just turn around, let's go back inside, I need to talk to you privately." And so Susan, who was very shocked by this, just said, "Okay," and she turned around and led the sheriff into her house while the other deputies fanned out across the property to begin this big search. Once inside of Susan's house, they sat down in her kitchen, and right away the sheriff says to Susan, "Okay, I have you on camera using Robert's EBT card. I know you stole it, so you need to tell me where Robert is right now, or it's going to get a whole lot worse for you." And as soon as he said this, Susan's look of shock on her face quickly turned into a look of kind of relief. It was like suddenly she understood what was going on here. And she says to the sheriff, "No, I didn't steal his EBT card. He gave it to me along with an envelope full of cash when he left 4 months ago, and he told me to use it to buy dog food for his dog that I'm looking after." And since Robert had been gone for all these months, she had run out of cash to pay for the dog food, and now was using the EBT card. Susan also added that if she had just stolen the card from Robert, she wouldn't be able to use it because it requires a PIN number, and Robert gave her the PIN number. That's how she was able to use it. The sheriff was not totally sold on Susan's story, and so he continued to ask more questions, trying to trip Susan up about how she came to acquire this card. But Susan was very firm that Robert had given her the card, and that was it. And so after several minutes, the sheriff realized that Susan was likely telling the truth, which meant the EBT card angle was likely a dead end, and they would have to call off this search. But as the sheriff was standing up to leave the kitchen and leave the property altogether, a deputy from outside came running into the kitchen and, without saying a word, just bent down and whispered into the sheriff's ear. And as the sheriff is listening to this deputy, his face is contorting in disgust. He can't believe what is being told. And after the deputy stands up and leaves the kitchen, the sheriff takes a deep breath and looks at Susan and says, "You're going to have to come with us." Back at the station, a now very flustered Susan was led into a small interrogation room where she sat down looking totally anxious. She's looking around wondering what's going on, and then the sheriff walked into the room, immediately hit record on the camera, and then looked at Susan and says, "Has anyone died on your property?" The story that Susan would tell the sheriff